Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schwartz. Welcome to episode 4 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schwartz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. As we record this episode, the theaters remain dark while we are in lockdown against the coronavirus. And as I speak, it is hard to know when or how it will be safe to gather together in a theater to properly share in the event of live performance. In the meantime, while we are sequestered in our individual lockdowns, some of us have had time to consume different kinds of dramatic stimulation and content. And I have to say that I've been uplifted by the amazing resilience and creativity of people in these challenging circumstances. There's been a welcome plethora of digital theater recordings to be watched online, for example. I confess that I watch these online performances with mixed feelings. I'm glad to be able to see them at all, of course, and certainly to support the theaters who are sharing them in these difficult times. It's also encouraging to think that they may be reaching large audiences who would not otherwise have been to the theater and maybe be inspired to do so as a result. On the other hand, of course, it's all too evident that watching theater on the screen is not the same as being there live. I think something the same when I watch festival concerts like Glastonbury on my tiny TV. It has lost most of the power of the original. The sheer volume of sound and people, of being a live part of it, of being there. Nothing can be done to replace that. However, finally, watching the slightly diminished digital version perversely makes me all the more fervent about the unique joys of live theater and our need to return to it. I can glimpse the truly amazing phenomenon that is other human beings, actors, becoming someone else to recreate and retell an interactive story together, without safety nets like recording and editing, all for us to witness close up in the same real space and time. What nerve, what energy, what joy can come from such communal risk? And so, back to our podcast and our play for today. As the lights in the auditorium go down, the stage is only dimly lit. We hear the following. The lights fade up to a bare function room. Water is dripping slowly from a skylight down onto the empty floor. We are in the Aberfan Hotel in South Wales. It is June 1967, 8 months after the mining disaster that claimed the lives of 116 children and 28 adults. The play we are about to see is called The Revlon Girl. It premiered in full in 2017, and I was lucky enough to see it at the Edinburgh Festival that summer, before I saw it again when it ran at the Park Theatre in London. That production was nominated for an Olivier Award in Outstanding Achievement at an Affiliate Theatre, and the play won Best New Play at the 2018 Off West End Awards. The play was written by Neil Anthony Docking, and I'm more than delighted to say that Neil is joining me via Zoom today to talk about his play. Big smile there, Neil, I can see you. This is the first time I've actually had the writer himself to speak to on the podcast. The others have all been dead, of course. Sorry, Neil, that sounds rather morbid. But the reason for that is this is also our first new play. I'm thrilled that Neil's here to talk to us. Welcome, Neil. Say hello, Neil.
Good morning. How are we?
I'm okay, thank you. I should do a proper introduction. Neil was born in South Wales and studied music at the University of Westminster before finding work as a writer in press, television, radio, and film, where his credits include Casualty, Emmerdale, Nuts and Bolts, The Throne Room, Station Road, and many, many more. He is married to the actor-director Maxine Evans, who also happened to expertly directed the first productions of The Revlon Girl. The Revlon Girl is also Neil's first play for the theatre, and I would hazard a guess that it was a labor of love, Neil. Was the Aberfan story one that affected you personally? Did you grew up in South Wales? Did you know people?
I didn't know people, but my father was a steelworker. My grandfathers were miners. And so and I was born in 1970, which was 4 years after the disaster. And growing up in Wales, you just knew about it. you absorbed it almost osmotically. So I don't remember a time not knowing that it had happened. And I think I was thinking about this the other day, and I was thinking, what was the first time you knew about it? And it was my father showing me a clipping from the newspaper. Now, my father worked in the steelworks in the day, but he sang in working men's clubs at night. And the weekend after, he was in a club called the Velindre Club, which is near Swansea. And the story in the newspaper was how the audience had missed the last bus going home because they'd asked for an encore because one of his songs was Green, Green Grass of Home, which is your kind of classic. Tom Jones had done it at the time. And this was obviously now a very Welsh, it's very cliched sound. But I remember being 5 or 6 and him showing me, look at this, boy. Look at you, I've got this, not that he speaks like this, it's terrible, he doesn't speak like this stuff. But he would show, and that people had been so, it must have been quite cathartic. I think that's what I didn't know any of this when I was a child. I didn't know the word catharsis. But essentially, I remember seeing that and thinking, why would they stay to hear the song? My father said, people were absolutely crying, and it was only a week later in a working men's club. So because of that, we always knew about it as this thing that had happened. But always remember, it was, my grandfather told me of stories of deaths underground. Deaths in factories and underground were not uncommon. So it was one of these exceptional things. So for a people, as it were, who were used to death and injury, and they were, it was everyday occurrence. This was truly exceptional. How it affected the rest of the country was what we didn't know. You know what I mean? As I did more research when I grew up, you start to realize this affected a lot of people. But for us, it was just this thing that had happened in a valley, not far away, but far enough away.
For those who may be too young or haven't watched the episode of The Crown about it, what happened? Tell us a little bit in a short version about what actually happened in Aberfan in October 1966.
Essentially, there's a little village not far from Merthyr Tydfil called Aberfan, and it's a tiny, tiny little mining village. And essentially what they used to do when they used to dig up the coal from the mine was that it used to come with what they called slag, which was all the waste material. So rock, rubbish, coal they couldn't sell, muck, and they used to tip it. Now, it was too expensive to take away. It was too expensive to bury underground. So they used to tip it on the mountainsides. And this was a feature. There was one opposite my house. And I didn't live in a valley. I lived quite in a flat. But the colliery my grandfather worked at, where they used to tip, was on the wasteland across from where I was brought up. So coal tips, a common feature in Wales. And there were 7 above the village of Aberfan. And at 9:15 on the 21st of October 1966, one of these tips slipped. And by slip, it literally comes down the mountain, around 150,000 tons of waste material, rock, coal, mud, slides down. It hits a farmhouse, kills everybody inside. It hits a water main, and then it hits the village. It's a row of houses, and then it glances off the senior school, and then it ploughs directly into the junior school. And 116 children died, mostly at their desks, but there were a few people who got caught in the slide as it came down the mountain.
Gosh, it's I've seen footage of it and photographs and stuff, and it's almost unimaginable how overwhelming the pictures are of the scale of this thing. Talking about, there were eyewitnesses talked about as it came down, it was like the noise of thunder, as we heard in our clip, and that it moved like quicksand. And then after it, that everything was so quiet, and all I could see was the apex of the roofs. And then, of course, everybody started trying to dig out the kids from, or anybody who was under there. And there were these other moments where they're talking about how the rescuers would all stop at some moment. A hush would fall over them because there may have been faint cries of people still alive under the rubble. And then they would carry on, digging with their hands or whatever they had to hand. Horrific idea.
Well, there were 2 things that always struck me when I read, because one of the best sources of research is the National Archive. And they have still transcripts from the inquiry. And there were two things in it that still struck me. The first was when this stuff comes down the mountain, it's full of water. But when it stops, the water runs off. So when they were digging, it wasn't soft mud. It was hard rock and coal.
Right.
Not ironically, but in a way, luckily, the men came from the mine, so they were used to digging. And by far one of the most touching things I ever read was that they had to prop the roof up to dig underneath it, because of course the slide goes into the school, the walls go, the walls are cracked. So one of the men said, right, we need to prop up this roof, boys. And the first thing they did was somebody brought out a tape measure. And they measured it once, because the old carpenters say, measure twice, cut once. And so used were they to digging and disaster underground, they knew exactly what to do. In other words, there would be no point just getting a plank of wood. We need to measure it. We need to make sure it's right, that it's strong, so that we can carry on digging. And of course, these things can never make it into a play, but it's always in the background of who did the digging, who was standing there when it happened.
Well, some elements of what you've just described will come out in the play, and we'll talk about. So I think one of the things that is really interesting about your play, and is why you chose the story you've chosen and the way into this story, because this is a massive tragedy, lots of people affected, a big scale event, and yet the play itself is a microcosm of that in some ways, and based on and is entitled, as it's entitled, The Revlon Girl. Where did the idea for the Revlon Girl part of it come from? Was that a true story? Is something originally about that?
It is a true story, and it's in a book by Joan Miller, and the book came out in the 70s, and she was either a social worker or a psychologist, and it was a paragraph in her book, and it was called Aberfan, A Disaster and Its Aftermath. And it's it's a nice book, but it's quite dull, to be perfectly honest. It's a bit kind of a study in Holland, said this about grief. And then in the middle of this, in the chapter on community, and this sounds very worthy, and it's not worthy at all, but there was a tiny paragraph about the women of Aberfan who got together every Tuesday night. Now, initially, they got together to protest. So they got together and what shall we protest? What shall we organise? Well, it's all been pretty much done. Anyway, at one of these meetings, and this is where the paragraph goes in Miller's book, she says, so they kind of got rid of the idea of protest or organisation. And they thought it would be just nice to get together every Tuesday to have a talk and a cry and a laugh without feeling guilty. And that's the sentence that really caught my eye. And it was the follow-on sentence where she said, at one of these meetings, they looked at each other and realised how much they'd let themselves go. But concerned or afraid of being judged frivolous, they secretly arranged for a representative from Revlon to come and give them beauty tips. And do you know one of those moments where you see everything at once? It suddenly became the way to tell that huge, huge story in one room with a bunch of people in an enclosed time space.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic intro to the play, because it sets the scene. It is set in the function room of the hotel, one of their weekly meetings, and they've arranged for the Revlon Girl to come to visit and to share some beauty tips, because, as you say, they think to themselves, maybe they've let themselves go a bit. But it's intriguing you to start with that thought that they wouldn't have been, they felt that they should keep this secret in some way, that it's too trivial or inappropriate. It is 8 months after the disaster, but of course that's nothing in time. But as we said earlier, the most dramatic things already happened. So now it's about just these 4 or 5 people who represent the 116 families who've lost something, and how they then are coping thereafter. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the structure of the play, because you pack a lot into a relatively short piece. One of the things that strikes me about the play, and given your background in TV, is that it actually happens in real time. There are no jumps forward or backward in time, as in television you get all the time. it just unfolds in real time. And it's these women attempting to behave normally, casually. It's the actual conversations they would have had in these meetings. And what you see, I guess, is these characters who are, as I said, attempting to behave normally, but who are suppressing all these devastating feelings, which of course they have, and trying to figure out how to behave normally. And the way the story unfolds is just the gradual reveal of what each of them has going on inside them, what they've been through, how they're coping with what they are going through. And it strikes me that there are like a series of thunderbolt moments in these key reveals that where these deeper truths burst forth, and it all feels every day and normal, and then bang, you get a thunderbolt, brings you back to the real tragedy of what's happened in their lives and the lives of the village. How conscious was that in terms of the structure, the way you put it together?
Even though I'm a big fan of structure. From a technical point of view, I love structure. And there are plenty of writers and practitioners who go on about this. And I've even done it, I've given little talks myself, and you always get somebody in the room that thinks it's rubbish. The 4-act structure and 5-act structure. This stuff doesn't apply to me. So even though I knew it was going to be a real-time thing, I still plotted it in 4 acts. So, because what I wanted basically, because not everybody knows about this disaster, and in fact, I think we discussed this in the past. I never wanted it to be a play just for people in Wales or in the UK or of a certain generation. In fact, the opposite was true. And so I had to structure it in a way that you would structure a film or another play with distinct act breaks. So the way it works for people who perhaps don't know is that essentially you get the story of Aberfan, in other words, what happened with the tip slide in the school, in a 4-act structure. So we go from the outside in. So we get the actual first bit, which I think is Marilyn's story, is that she tells you what happens on the morning. But and then the next story is getting slightly closer to it. So it was actually structured in a kind of 4-act, 5-act way, but to do it with the story of Aberfan itself, so you get closer to it as the stories unfold, as each individual women's story unfolds. So
sorry to interrupt. I also think it's a series. That's how each act could be one of the characters. So each character is very clearly drawn and has their own unfolding story there, with again hints of reveal, but then certain big moments where they become the center stage, and their story unfolds to the full extent. So it's very much based on those characters and their individual stories, all of whom I think also represent different responses to grief and how to express it. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. But I think character is so important here because they're so clearly delineated. And by the way, one of the reasons we were so interested to publish it, and I should confess that I have a personal interest in this play. Usually in the podcast, we start off by saying where we first came across it. And I don't want to miss doing that, because I first saw the play, Neil, up in Edinburgh with my colleague, our rights director, Stephen, when I was working at Samuel French. And so this was a professional visit. But I came out of the show completely overwhelmed, in bits, really, and said to my colleague, Stephen, we have to publish this play on no certain terms. And so I said, we immediately have to seek out Neil, the author, which we did. And then we plied him with drink, and to the point where we shook hands by the end of the night on a deal to publish. So I have a passionate personal interest in it, but I've lost the track of why I started that story, except to come back to the characters. And that each of these characters, I know why, because they're great female roles as well. Each of them is a great role. And I think when I saw it, each time I saw it, the actresses did a wonderful job, but each of them got a hold of it in a great way. So my question, I suppose, is how did you come across creating these believable, consistent characters, and who they are? Are they based on real people, or how did you come up with what they are, different ones?
It's a really good question. I think because I was very lucky to know personally Arnold Wesker, the playwright. Actually, my wife knew very well, right? And it was in the days when he obviously he was writing plays. I was writing for TV, and we went because he had this cottage in Hay-on-Wye. And like a lot of city people, they love the country. Do you know what I mean? He was brought up in Stepney, so he wanted to go in Wales to live, which is the opposite for me. God, I don't know. I wonder where there's running water. And I remember saying to him once about, so how's your new play going, Arnold? You know, chatting away over dinner. And he said, do you know what? He said, I can't remember how I wrote the last one. And at the time, I had no idea what he meant. I had no idea. And now I do, because it's trying to remember what you did. Because you can't remember But what I do remember is the theme idea. Because again, I love themes. You know, I love the idea of dramatizing a theme. So I basically thought there were 4, maybe 5 themes, and which coincide with reaction. So Rona is, her basic function is anger and feeling foolish, that she believed the assurances that these tips wouldn't go. Somebody like Jean.
Sorry to interrupt there. Perhaps it'll be best if for people who don't know the play, if we just backed up a bit. This is a great way to intro the characters themselves, Neil. So maybe we could just do that, and then people would have a better idea about who we're talking about. So Rona, cool. You mentioned. Yeah. How would you describe Rona?
Thematically, it's to do with anger and foolishness, or feeling foolish. So there's a line that she says that I'm not gonna stand in line and wait to be tapped on the head and told I'm a good little girl. That's her kind of her anger. Jean,
she's also the voice, therefore, focus for outrage at all the institutional negligence and accountabilities and things. She becomes that voice, but she's also incredibly outspoken, foul-mouthed, and indomitable, energetic. She's also a voice for humor, which we'll also talk about, because she's very funny as well, isn't she?
In truth, this is the other thing, and this sounds a little bit pretentious, but each of them is me. There's part of them that is me. Rona is most like me. So my genuine reaction to most things is to start shouting, swearing, and saying stupid things. She does a lot of that. She does a lot of that. It's that kind of, and also that kind of bluntness, because when you were speaking earlier about the explosive moments, she does that. She says things that are so harsh. It's partly self-indulgent, but it's that rage. I mean, rage is the best word. But the only way you can really sometimes portray rage is funny.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. So rage, she represents that rage as one of the ways one responds in grief, and what form that rage takes, as you say, can be various. And one of those first thunderbolt moments, which really hits home, was in the early part of the play. Is there's talking about the fund that's been raised, the charity fund, and what it's going to be used for. And she has heard through the grapevine that there is an idea to build a swimming pool. And she just keeps going, what kind of crazy idea is this swimming pool? And partly I have to confess that, being somewhat ignorant, I would go, what's wrong with the swimming pool? And she comes right out with it finally and says, I don't know who they think is going to swim in this pool. All the kids are dead. Bang. I mean, oh boy, hit between the eyes on that moment.
Yes, and it is that thing of partly in the scene, it's because she is being ignored by Jean, the other character. Now, it's important to say, all of these women know each other. 3 of them we established went to school together. Where Sian, who's the much more bright, optimistic, younger character, probably more in the age group of Revlon, who's the youngest of all, this very innocent, English, lovely, puts her foot in her mouth all of the time type. Whereas Marilyn, Rona and Jean are the same age, and so they've got a history together. So in the actual moment it happens, it becomes about Jean, who is not an authoritarian figure, but she's married to a minister. She's much more, she likes committees, she likes order, and she's also very religious.
Yeah, so Jean, she's fascinating. Jean, you describe her as stately, conservative, and sociable, and she came from the same background as Marilyn and Rona, but she's now the wife of the church minister and therefore regards herself as a pillar of the community. But then she becomes the focus, I think, of a couple of themes. I'm sure you had at least one or more of these in mind. One is, of course, is to do with the religion, because she's married to the vicar. And this becomes, I think, one of the most fascinating themes through the play for me, is how in the wake of such tragedy, people asking, how can an interventionist God have allowed such arbitrary terribleness as the deaths of these children? How can you retain your faith in the aftermath of that? And of course, so these questions are raised for Jean, because she is continuing to demonstrate that in theory she does have this faith, and does retain it, and that this should still be a sense of solace. And it tries to explain, I guess, at one stage that the children, and this is one of the classic tropes, I suppose, religiously, is that children don't actually, she says, they don't even belong to us, the mothers or the families, they belong to God. And so they are now with God in heaven. And you think, okay, all very well, but the skeptical among us. And then even more, it gets even more personal, I think, and more moving, because Jean is also pregnant. 8 months pregnant. Now, this is 8 months after the tragedy. But the thing about her pregnancy is, and you very cleverly, she seems to be uneasy about it, does not like it being referred to. The others say to the Revlon Girl, don't talk about her pregnancy. So she's having some kind of ambiguous emotional reaction to this pregnancy. And through the play, there's a question of what is going on there. Why is she responding like this? Did she conceive the child after or before the event? In the end, spoilers here, but in the end, it's clear that she conceived, she thinks, a few days before the event. And she says even that God saw fit to give me a child only to take another. So she still thinks, there's something in terms of the religious fate of what's happening to her. But does she believe that? There's still a question that she says, I didn't want this one. I wanted the one I had. So that describing her uneasiness about these feelings. But all of this is about that question of their faith and what do we think about God in these circumstances. Fascinating. Tell me a bit more about how you thought about religion and this question.
I'm not really, I've never been religious. In fact, you could call me a lifelong atheist. So in a sense, Jean is further away from me than possible. And yet we all have superstition. We all have that sense of the other. But for me, Jean is trapped. She is in fact, to play is the most complex of the characters, because essentially there are two things going on. You hit on it beautifully, which is the idea of interventionist God. So the logic should go, I'm a good Christian. I go to church. I am married to one of the greatest Christians, who's my husband, and he's a minister. This terrible thing's happened, so why me, God? What did I do that was wrong? Now, Jean actually, no matter for all her stately airs and graces, she's as rough as Rona and the others, really. She's had this veneer over the years of being a little bit more respectable. But when you get to her, she will punch you in the face. There's no doubt in my mind, right? She's rough. But she's trapped in the sense that she's trapped by her own veneer, her own respectability, her own status. She's trapped by her husband, because he's the minister and he has to keep saying, and this is true, by the way, what happened was that the ministers on the Sunday after, one of whom had lost a child, had to give a service and give meaning to this. Now, that's got to be tough, number one. But the other thing is her reaction is to hate God, right? That's really what she's going on about. Why did you do that? And you did the other thing. You gave me another child, as if that's going to make up for it. And the two things going on, of course, is a social thing. Will people think I'm trying to replace my other child? Because that's what we all think. That's the taboo if a child dies and a person gets pregnant again. That's what there is a part of us that think that. But she is stuck in that if she stops believing in God, she will never see her dead son again.
Yeah.
So she has to keep believing because heaven is waiting for them both. Now, the conflict, if you like, is her instinct to reject it all, to be angry at it, but knowing that if she's too angry, if God becomes even more displeased for whatever reasons, because as you know, all religions work in the same way, which is if you do a good thing or you observe your rituals well, you will be rewarded. And of course, we have the saying, why do bad things happen to good people? That's where it comes from. So the denouement, as it were, her big reveal is admitting how much she hates what has happened, and it is actually coming to terms that her story, if you like, is accepting that she's going to have a new a baby. Because when they say don't mention it, it's because anytime anybody mentions, so how are you feeling? Or she goes ballistic because, and of course we never see this, we just know not to mention it. And there's a big speech, as you know, at the end, where she basically says that I didn't want this child. So if anybody's any doubt about me replacing this child, you are wrong. I don't want this one. I want the one I had.
Well, this is interesting is that, that kind of reaction to grief, and I'm sure there's evidence that this is one of the reactions that could occur. The point you made about her clinging to her faith because finally she wants to believe that she will see her son again in heaven really hit home to me too, because a personal story here. During my teenage years, I went through the usual rebellion with my folks of saying I'm not going to church. I was born and raised in Canada and went to the Baptist church, and it wasn't fire and brimstone Baptist. It was a high Baptist and everything. But I, being a teenager, decided I didn't believe in this and I wasn't going to be dragged to it. And at one stage, my mother just said to me that one of the reasons for my father's faith was that he believed that we would all be together as a family in heaven when we died. And that hit me in the gut. I still carried on with my rebellion, being a teenager, but I carried that with me all my life. The depth of this belief that my father had, which he never expressed. I would never have heard it from him directly. But it's obviously a powerful one. Jean's story is fascinating for those reasons. She also, it turns out, she's also has a daughter. So her son died in the disaster. And she talks a lot about how clever her son was and what a great, bright future her son was going to have. And by comparison, she's less complimentary about her daughter. And it appears that she's ignoring her daughter. So again, there's another question and potentially about how people deal with grief and with their children they still have and are responsible for. And that story is reflected by the Revlon Girl herself, who we could just chat about a bit in terms of the way the part she plays in the play. It's entitled The Revlon Girl. She is essentially a catalyst, it strikes me, that comes in and allows these and somehow provokes in some way or other, not even knowingly, some these stories come out. But also interesting because she's part of the outside world. She sort of represents us. She's very uneasy about how to deal with these women who are in such grief. Our nervousness would be her nervousness. I mean, I never know how you should best behave with people like this in these circumstances. So she is us in that regard. She's also an alternative woman. She's interestingly young, but also independent. She's not married. She's earning her own living. She has a nice car. She's a sales rep a rep for the Revlon company. She has a car, her own flat, her own TV. It comes out. So in the 1960s, she's an independent woman. And that's really fascinating because these other women are not like that. And initially, Rona particularly somehow resents her that she has this freedom and this wealth, apparently. When in fact, of course, Rona is exactly the character who should respect her the most, because Rona is one who wants to get out of the village and is the most independent-minded in that sense. Isn't that right?
Yeah, but it's odd because I'm going to have to reveal my hand here. Now, lots of people listening to this will think I am born of aristocracy. They'll be listening to me now and they'll be thinking, clearly this man is landed gentry. But I've got news, I'm not. I'm your basic working class model.
I never thought that.
Yeah, I see it. That's it. You see, I know. I'm sorry, I should work on my accent a bit. And what always made me, especially because I live in London now, and when the hand I'm revealing is the attitude towards independent women. So, for example, my wife, who studied at Guildhall as an actor, when she arrived, feminism was the thing. Feminism and acting, you see, that you were a woman first, then an actor, then anything else, you see, and I'm a big fan of Germaine Greer's writing, but there was a kind of divide in the classes. So that there's a kind of you're quite right. Rona wants what Revlon is, material things. That's it. But there are different types of independence. And all the women I ever grew up with worked, shot their mouth off, were not told to do anything. But then when I moved to London, there was this kind of idea that women had always been oppressed and weren't allowed to work and told to shut up and sit in the corner kind of idea. Now, still now, I mean, if you've met Maxine, you know what she's like. There is nothing that I recognise in that. But however, for Revlon, she is exactly this thing and represents that kind of 60s feminism. I mean, this is a very low level thing in the play, but there is a bit where she says about voting and how important it is that the women vote, and Rona has to say, well, good God, she said, is that right? And she turns to Marilyn and she said, do you hear that? It's important for us to vote. We have to fight for our vote. Where were we that day? Meaning we've been with the men on the picket lines, and that was my childhood. You know, women went out on the picket lines with the men. So this idea that women had to be, that weren't already fighting or weren't already in the thick of it, I always slightly resented anyway. So putting Revlon, who is, again, and love her, she's got the best intentions, you know what I mean? And she's constantly trying to find a connection with these women. Anything other than makeup, she's trying to find some connection. So she thinks this might be it, because politics is part of this now. The government, the council, the coal board, all these organisations, they've all failed. Yes, they've all failed. And then there's that terrible thing where somebody turns around and say, what do you know about it? So in terms of the independence, as you say, that's still my slight dig, my class dig, that as far as I ever saw it, women were involved in everything and were not put in a corner. You know what I mean? If you tried, it would be trouble.
It's impossible to come away from the play not impressed by the resilience and the power and of these women individually, whatever their vocation in life. They are carrying huge amounts in terms of their family. They all have strong wills and independent minds, and demonstrate that in the play. It's just in social terms, I think there was a difference painted there, which I thought was interesting. And of course, you see it immediately because the way she's dressed and comes in, and she's beautifully made up and all of that. And then, as you said, the way she does make the connection towards the end is very touching, because she tells a story of her own life where her older brother died, drowned at the age of 10 on a school trip. And her mother withdrew into herself and gave up caring for herself or her family, and in particular wouldn't bother about her appearance. She wouldn't go out in the world, wouldn't put her makeup on in the morning, and until a point where Revlon Girl reveals that she helped her mother. At some point, her mother came back to herself and wanted to make an effort and putting her makeup and her lipstick on in particular was a signal that she was preparing herself or ready to go back into the world. Now, this becomes pretty significant, of course, and obviously a metaphor and part of the whole play in terms of why they're there for these beauty tips, for their own self-respect, and which is somehow going to fortify them for carrying on. And this is in particular, I think, the most devastatingly with the story of Sean, who we talked about at the beginning there, or a little while back, about how she's a bit younger. She's trying to remain positive. She's a bit of the peacekeeper. So throughout, she's essentially trying to keep the feathers unruffled and smooth things over and keep things going and trying. But towards the end, we get her full story, which is devastating. How her husband, she tells, as you described earlier, about those stages of the disaster. She tells the story of them trying to dig the children out of the school. Her husband's a miner. He's one of the first out. And he's digging with his hands in this, searching in one of the schoolrooms for her son, Paul. And there are terrible images in this story, as we know, of that digging, and then of the kids being lined up on the pavement or on the ground under blankets, rows of dead children, and then the small coffins lined up in a single trench at the funerals, and all of those things horrifying. But then we learn even more about the way that this couple has responded, that David in particular has responded to the loss. He's turned in on himself, hasn't been sharing his grief with her, and she's found this really difficult because they haven't been going through this together as she sees it. And then in, I think, what is one of the final thunderbolts of the play, Sean reveals that one of the things she wants from the Revlon Girl is to help her look attractive again, so that David will find her attractive, so that she can create another child, a child who she will love even harder than the last one. Whoa. I'm having problems even just relaying that, Neil. So yeah, just tell us a bit about Sean's story there. Where did that come from?
That's again a very good question. I think again the part of me, it's terrible to say me, but it's because nothing like this has happened to me. Do you know what I mean? I am 50 and I have got away scot-free so far. You know what I mean? I am really lucky. So I think there was always, and I tell you what, I have, however, had people fairly close to me who have had great loss, even children themselves, you know, as in they've lost children. And one of the things that struck me was how sometimes the rest of us will put those people in aspect. We will freeze them in time, that they will only ever be the bereaved parent or the damaged person, to use a very broad term. And so what Sean for me would be my own thing of, will you let me go? Will you let me get beyond this terrible thing? And even when we were promoting the play the first time, I remember going on it was a local chat show down in Wales. And one of the interviewers, I think she must have just read the brief when we got there on the interview, and she couldn't believe that that these people were still suffering. And I said, yeah, but they're not frozen in time. They've all moved on. And I started talking about Sean. I said, actually, there's a character who is desperate to go beyond this. But the awful truth, again, this is a big sweeping statement. I always noticed how women have to worry about themselves and their men. So they're only worrying about how am I dealing with this? How's he dealing with it? Women will ask each other, how is he? Is he all right? How's he get? And so they have to do the both things. And for me, that was Sean, which is going, this man now cannot function. And of course, in his mind, is a failure. He has been, he is not literally, I suppose, impotent. He wasn't able to save his son. And worse, one day she caught him crying. When she was out, he let himself weep in a chair. And a lot of women of the time, again, this is all from research, reported the same thing, where men would be fine and drinking went up, you know what I mean, that people did do the obvious things that we would all do. But they would come back and see that he'd been crying on his own. His eyes would be red And they'll ask, have you been crying? No, I'm fine, because that idea I've got it. So one day she catches him weeping, and from that moment he can't look at her anymore, because I not only did I not save my son, I am not strong enough for you. Now he won't touch her, he won't go any near her. So her only way of moving forward, and this is why she's so chuffed, when Revlon turns up at the beginning, she's amazingly chuffed that oh God, at last you've come. This is great, because now tonight's the night. You make me beautiful. I will walk. This is what she says, I think, doesn't she? Where she says, I'll walk in that door and he will see me.
Yeah. So I think
that's the line, isn't it?
Yes, and I think it's interesting that you talk about them being seen in a different way. So what she wants partly is to go back to her husband, to recognize what she was and what they have together, because she talks about when they met, of course, and went dancing every week, and that her husband originally thought her eyes were beautiful. So one of the things they do, of course, is they work on the makeup around her eyes, and Revlon Girl says, your eyes really are beautiful. And obviously she wants him to see that again, so she can be that person again. I mean, this is all another one of those fascinating insights, Neil, into how people deal with grief. I mean, and one of which is, of course, is you talked about you're touching on is guilt about how they feel or what they couldn't do or their impotence. And I think, well, again, in a small way, there are so many moving moments in the play, but one of them is with Marilyn, who we haven't talked a lot about. She is a quiet, nervous one, obsessively going over things, trying to figure out some rationale for what occurred. She lost 2 daughters, I believe, in it. And she keeps looking for reasons. She has obviously has a bit of a thing with Jean, the vicar's wife, because she doesn't think that God has anything to do with it. And she's very angry that if there was one, that God took these children from her. But I think the really devastating one is that she is harboring in some gut-wrenching way a feeling of guilt, because she has a very simple line where she goes on often about the warnings. And this, obviously, one of the issues of Aberfan was that many times there were warnings about the potential danger of this tip. And her daughter had drawn a diagram, a picture of the tip and some catastrophic possibility could be interpreted from her drawing, but isn't really. But she says in the end, there were warnings, and still I sent them to school. And there was that moment, again, a thunderbolt moment, where you just go, oh God, this poor woman feels like if I'd only kept them home, it's my fault somehow. I mean, irrational, but the idea of blaming oneself, is that a common element? Did you find that in researches, or?
And again, I'm sure people would shout to me for saying this, but I tend to find it's women tend to blame themselves more than men. Men tend to say, it's your fault, not my fault, your fault, straight off the bat. But again, it's that the tyranny of the logic, of our own logic, which is if they were, and of course, again, to broaden or describe it a bit more, is she went to church, but she's also quite superstitious. So she's into a medium, isn't she? She gets a medium and the medium says she can reach her 2 girls. And Rona and the others saying, listen, these people just want your money, stay away from them. That is also true, by the way. There were a lot of mediums saying that we can put you in touch with your kids. So what she wants is the ability to see the future, which is superstition all over. And we're having it now. There are more superstitious things because of a virus than you've ever heard. But it's the same reaction. Was there a way of knowing this could come out of nowhere? Randomness and chaos tends to frighten people. But if you like, it keeps going down and down, because that moment you're talking about in that section is the bit that always got me. I saw the play 15,000 times, and her speech and the bit with Rona where they basically admit that if you like, there was nothing that they could do. It always used to kill me every night. But yes, basically, I've talked myself around this. The logic for her is there were warnings and I missed them.
So interesting. Yeah, I mean, you're right that it's interesting. You felt like that because it's a quiet. It's one of the quieter characters, one of the quieter moments, but it still is devastating. And then you talk about the could they see it coming and thing. Of course, there are the issues that they could see it. There were warnings and all that. And I think one of the other things that touched me, of course, when we first saw this play together was the timing of it was amazing because at some point Rona talks about how this will be forgotten in 50 years, but there'll be another disaster like this. I don't know exact words, but something along those lines. And of course, when we saw the play, and I saw the play in August 2017, I think it was a matter of weeks after Grenfell. And it couldn't have been more telling, really. And you always hear that, authorities and everyone will say, well, we're going to do something so that this sort of thing never happens again. And I never really believe that we as human beings are ever capable of avoiding these things, because there's always ways to cut corners in cost terms or whatever it is that contribute to these factors, which come again and again and again and end up with these kinds of costs to pay. So I mean, in terms of that foresight, yeah, well, they may have had a point.
Yeah, I mean, again, to reveal my hand, my reaction to this disaster, like many disasters, but this particular one, will always be, to refer back to Arnold Wesker, he and I had a discussion once, and of course he was a working class boy from Stepney, and he once suggested to Melvyn Bragg on a Radio 4 show that he was ambivalent towards the working classes, his own people, in that in one respect they were the salt of the earth and he would want to be nothing else, but at the same time they drove him nuts because they used to do and say things that used to drive him nuts. And in this play, and again because Rona is that part of me, that because she felt stupid for listening, she felt stupid for believing the authorities. I part of that speech, which was the first time it was written, was in 2015. Her speech never changed, and it would always be the thing that people would forget. But I think, if anything, I always wanted her speech to remind people, and by people I mean the little people, me, us, not to believe. And I'm not talking about sedition for the sake of it or cynicism. What I'm saying is, and what I hope that people would take away from that was, don't believe everything you're told. Bruce Springsteen used to have this great moment, didn't he, when he used to do War, the old What Is It Good For song. And he used to start it with a great introduction. I used to love it. And he used to say, blind faith in your leaders or authority will get you killed. Anyway, when I was 18 when I heard that, and I thought, that's the best thing I've heard. But it stuck with me. And in a sense, and going back to the Grenfell thing, which while we were rehearsing, oddly enough, it was going on. And I kept thinking, this is exactly the same thing. But once again, you heard stories of people who lived in the tower block, a door was missing. And I complained and blah, blah, blah. And people are so well behaved and so respectful, they don't take any action themselves. And in my head, and as Rona, I'm shouting like she would, do it yourself. Go down B&Q. Buy a door, fit it, send the council the bill, because they'll send somebody down then. They'll send somebody, and you'll probably have a fine. And my overriding sense, and I suppose it's sharing that guilt, is to remember to just sometimes make a noise, not to take it. If you truly believe, hang on, that thing there's lots of flooding. It's behind a school. I think something could happen. And so it was a really weird thing watching Grenfell unfold. And what I mean is the reaction to it and how similar it was. And, not history repeating itself, but it does certainly rhyme. But even I was saying again, this is another reminder, because all authorities are fallible in the end. And there is always something that can go wrong. And I'll just very quickly, at the inquest, Desmond Ackner, who represented the village and the villagers, he ended with a George Bernard Shaw quote, which, again, if I could have got in the play, I would have. It's such a beautiful idea. And he said, the worst thing you can, I'm probably paraphrasing, but the worst thing you can show your fellow man is indifference, because therein lies inhumanity. And I think that is the core of
Yeah, I thought that the thing that's so, I think the thing that's so great about the play, Neil, is that we get that rage from Rona, and we get some of this about the injustice, but it doesn't overwhelm it, and it doesn't become just about that. It's,
No,
you
not.
said earlier, it's about it making this play universal in the sense that these are women dealing with hardship and grief of any kind, and their relationships within their families and for themselves, so that it becomes more universal. And it's not sensationalized in that sense. It's not a polemic. It's a domestic in that sense.
Absolutely.
Best sense. Now, we're running out of time. Unfortunately, we could talk for a lot longer as ever. Before we bring the curtain down today, Neil, one of the fixtures of our podcast is that I ask our guests to recommend a play that we should devote an episode to of the podcast. So, I mean, is there a play that's important to you, or that you would recommend, that personal favorite that we could talk about on our podcast at some time in the future?
I was hoping to think of something really clever, something that was technically difficult, and I haven't been able to. And I'm sure somebody's already mentioned this, but All My Sons, I think Arthur Miller, and I'll say why, is because, first of all, it was one of those plays I saw that blew me away, genuinely blew me, as a grown-up. Not a kid. I didn't see it as a child. I saw The Crucible as a kid, but I didn't see All My Sons. And I went to see it in the open air Regent's Park Theatre. And it was the best production I'd ever seen. I mean, it was just, because the story, everything was just so brilliant. But then I went to see the one at the Old Vic with Bill Pullman in, and it was terrible. Sorry for everybody who was involved in it. I just thought it was terrible. And suddenly I saw how a great play can be done in a great way and a not so great way. But I think it's just one of those plays, if you've never seen, and it was one of his first, wasn't it? I think it perhaps one of Miller's first plays. I'm not sure. But yes, All My Sons.
It's a great suggestion. And actually what you just said is interesting, because the play somehow survives those productions as well. Because I've seen it several times, and I saw that Old Vic production. It doesn't matter. The play is still gut-wrenchingly, fantastically powerful, about the family relationships, about the guilt, about the mother of the guilt of the father, about the mother who's, can't accept that her son was killed in the war, etc. And so we'll put it on the list, is what I'm saying. All My Sons by Arthur Miller.
Put it on the list.
Thank you, Neil. Thanks so much for joining me today. It's so great to see you again, and I've really loved revisiting the Revlon Girl with you. As our curtain falls today, our discussion may leave you with the impression that this is an unrelentingly sad play. It is heartbreaking, but it is also very funny and ultimately uplifting, as one comes away full of admiration for the indomitable spirit of people who continue with their lives in the face of hardship and unimaginable grief. It's not just lipstick, it's self-respect and hope. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.